Hi, everybody. So in today's lesson, we're going to learn three things. We're going to learn the point system, so how many points are each pieces. We're going to learn the special moves, and we're also going to learn checks. Okay, so let's start with the easiest. Let's start with the point system. Now, the point system is actually is like a little system that we use as a reference point. It's not like super important when we excel in more advanced levels, but for now it is important. And we use the point system so that we don't give good pieces for little pieces. All right, so let's start with the pawn. Everybody, we know how a pawn goes. We talked about it in last class. A pawn goes forward and it cannot go backwards, and a pawn captures diagonally. Pawn is the only piece that moves and captures in a different way. So everybody, the pawn is worth the least amounts of points. The pawn is worth 1 point. The more points we have, the better the piece is, the stronger the piece is. Now let's talk about the knight. Okay, let's talk about the knight. Everybody, the knight is worth 3 points. And now let's talk about the bishop. Everybody, the bishop is actually worth the same as the knight. And the bishop is also worth 3 points. And now let's talk about the rook. Everybody, the rook is worth a little bit more than a bishop or a knight. It is worth, whoops, it is worth 5 points. And now we're going to go over the strongest piece on the chessboard, which is the queen. Everybody, you see the queen is worth 9 points. In some books, they also call this 10 points, but 9 is a better reference point. All right. And lastly, we have the king. Now, everybody, this is very important. On a chess game, on a regular chess game, you cannot capture the king. Okay? We cannot eat the king on the chessboard. This is very important. Therefore, the king actually doesn't have a value. The king is like infinity points, or you can think like it's 1 million points. We actually cannot really capture the king on the chessboard. That is not how we win the game. Now, we are going to go over how we win the game in the next lesson when we go over checkmates. So the least amount of points that we can have is 1, and that is the worth of the pawn. Pawn isn't worth too much. And then we have the knight and the bishop. They're both worth 3 points each. And then we have the rook, everybody. Rook is worth a little bit more than the knight or a bishop. It's worth 5 points. Next, we have the queen. Queen is worth 9 points. And then the king, everybody. The king is worth the game. You cannot play a game without a king. And you actually cannot physically capture a king on the chessboard. So these are the points of the pieces. Okay. We'll also go over this a few times in our next classes, so you don't have to like memorize it right now, but it is a good reference to know. All right. So everybody, let's talk about the special moves. We have 3 special moves in chess. The reason why we call them special is because they don't follow the regular chess rules. So these are special cases, everybody. The first special case is actually going to be with the pawn. Now, everybody, as we know, a pawn can go 2 scores when it first starts. This is one of the rules. And a pawn captures diagonally in one square. Now you see everybody, the first special move we're going to see is called en passant. It's a French word. Let me write it. En passant, everybody, is a special pawn rule. And a pawn, if a white pawn is at the 5th rank, so this only happens for white pawns if they're on the number 5 line, right? Only on this line. And a black pawn goes 2 squares right next to our pawn, either with this F pawn or with the D pawn. Either way is fine. If they go 2 squares like this, everybody, normally we cannot capture this black pawn because there's nothing at white's diagonal. However, this is a special rule, everybody. Since this pawn is going right next to our pawn and it lands right next to it, we actually can capture this black pawn like this, as if the black pawn only went 1 square. But this is a special move. And if white wants to capture this pawn, we have to capture it right after black moves it to here. If white makes another move and then black makes another move, now white can no longer capture this black pawn. Because the ship has sailed, everybody. The opportunity is gone. In a special case, you can only do it when that special position is available. Now, everybody, this F pawn, let's make a move for white. This F pawn could also go 2 squares right next to our E pawn. And because they want 2 squares right now, right next to our pawn that is on this 5th rank, we can actually capture this black pawn like this. But if we want to capture this pawn, we have to capture it right away, everybody. So again, if you do something else, in the next turn, you cannot capture this pawn anymore. And it is up to you. Maybe you don't want to capture this black pawn. If you don't have to. But if you do, then you have to capture it right away. And after we capture this pawn, they can capture us too. Now, this is what we call en passant. So for white, it's the 5th rank. For black, everybody, let me start from the beginning position. For black, it's going to be the 4th rank, because that's where the black pawn is going to be at when a white pawn goes 2 squares. So let's see an example position. Okay, now everybody, you see in this position, the black pawn is on this 4th rank. So if a white pawn goes 2 squares right next to this pawn, right? If this white pawn goes to here, it's not right next to it. So the special move doesn't work. En passant doesn't work. But if white moves the D pawn instead, now if black wants, black can capture that white pawn just like this. But again, if black wants to capture it, they have to capture it right now. And this is a special move, everybody. This only works on the 4th rank for black and on the 5th rank for white. For example, if the black pawn was here, and let's say white didn't capture this pawn, instead white moved this pawn to here, now black cannot do an en passant, because again, it's not in that special location. And this is what we call en passant. Now, everybody, we're going to see the next special move, and this is also related to the pawn. And this is what we call pawn promotion. All right. Everybody, when we start, you see there's a lot of chess pieces on the chessboard. And when a pawn goes up, there's only a certain amount of squares that it can go. It can go all the way up. Let's talk about the white pawns. All the way up to this number 8 line, right? This is the last line. There's nothing more than the number 8 line. That's where the board ends. And this is a very dangerous journey for the pawn. If a pawn can go forward towards the enemy line, the pawn is very brave. And if it reaches the last line in the enemy's territory, the pawn gets rewarded. The pawn gets a promotion, everybody. And let me show you what we mean by this. I'm going to place 2 kings and 2 pawns. So everybody, the white pawn is going towards the number 8 line, and the black pawn is going towards the number 1 line, towards down, right? And you see, if this white pawn goes all the way up to this last square, everybody, this pawn can turn into a queen. Or we can also turn this into a rook, or a bishop, or a knight. We have 4 options, and you can turn this pawn into one of those pieces. We usually, like 99% of the time, we turn the pawn into a queen. We promote the pawn into a queen. You can also promote it to a rook, bishop, or a knight. But once you promote it, everybody, once the pawn promotes into a queen, you cannot turn this queen back into a pawn. This is now a queen. It is no longer a pawn. So you now have a white queen on the board. And one important thing, this pawn, everybody, cannot stay as a pawn. It has to get promoted. Because see, there's no more square for the pawn to move, right? As we said, pawn only goes forward, and there's no more forward squares. Can we get out of the chessboard with the pawn? No. No piece can get off the chessboard unless they get captured. So we can turn this pawn, if you want, into a knight. All right. And everybody, also the pawn cannot stay. Okay, we said the pawn cannot stay as a pawn. The pawn cannot turn into a king. This is very important. You can only have 1 white king and 1 black king on the chessboard. So therefore, the pawn can turn into a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. And that is what we call pawn promotion. And let me show you how black can try to promote everybody. Let's say white doesn't try to capture that. And now black's pawn can also turn into a queen. When you want to do this on a chessboard, what you do is you move the pawn all the way up, and then you remove the pawn once it reaches the last square, and you place a queen into that square. Usually chess sets, they come with 2 queens. One is extra, one is for situations like this. All right. Okay. Okay, nobody's here, so I always ask, does anybody have any questions on this? But yeah, when we will have our like interactive classes, you will be able to ask me any questions. But yes, so this is the second special move. This is what we call pawn promotion. Now, everybody, the last special rule we have is called castling. All right. So everybody, in a castle, that's where the king lives. So a castle, everybody, is a special move that the king does with the rook. When both the knight and the bishop moves, between the king and the rook, everybody, when these two squares are empty, right now white can move the king 2 squares. This is a special move. As we know, king only goes 1 square all the time, but when it comes to castling, which we can only do 1 time per game, per side, the king can go 2 squares. So everybody, in the special move, the king goes 1, 2 squares, and then after we move the king 2 squares, you move the rook from the one side of the king to the other side. And this is considered as one move. Okay, even though it seems like we're doing 2 moves, this is considered as one move, and this is a special case. This is what we call castling. The king and the rook should be able to go towards each other, everybody, so the knight and the bishop should move away. And in a castle, the king goes 2 squares. This is a special move. Now, everybody, for us to be able to do a castle, you see the king and the rook, they have to be untouched, unmoved. Like, even if you move the king, let's say some place like this, and you move it back, even if you come back to the original place, you can no longer do a castle. You see, the king cannot go 2 squares anymore. The king has to be untouched. It is the same for the rook, everybody. Let me take it back. Let's say white moves the rook to here, and now white cannot do a castle right now here. And even if you move it back to the original place, everybody, right now, white cannot do a castle. So the king and the rook, they have to be untouched. This is very important. And the reason why we do a castle is we want to do a castle because it puts the king into a safer position. And we're going to see some situations like this. Okay. Now, everybody, as you can see, there are 2 rooks on the chessboard. So you can actually do 2 castles on the board. So let me start from the beginning. But you can only do 1 castle in a game. So you have to decide which side you want to castle at. And the same thing is correct. For us to be able to do a castle, the king and the rook should be able to run towards each other, right? So there shouldn't be any pieces in between. So let's try to do this other castle. Okay, so I'm just making random moves, everybody, because as we know, you cannot make a move before the opponent completes their turn, right? So after you make your move, you have to wait for the opponent to make a move, and then we're ready to go. Okay, so everybody, in this position, we're going to do a castle on this part of the board. This is also what we call the queen side, because if you cut the board in the middle, this is where the queen is, and this is where the king is. So we call this the king side, and we call this the queen side. This is just a little knowledge. All right. So everybody, in this position, as we said, in a castle, the king goes 2 squares. This is a special case. So it's the same exact thing here. If we want to do a castle, we move the king 1, 2 squares. And now, after we move the king to here, we're going to bring the rook from one side of the king to the other side. And this is considered as one whole move. It is a special move. And everybody, since there's more squares here between the king and the rook, this is what we call a long castle, or you can also call this the queenside castle. And if black wants to do a castle here, they can. The king goes 2 squares, and now we move the rook right next to the king. And the king is now doing, the black king is doing what we call a short side, a short castle or a kingside castle. And these are the two castles that we can do on a game. Two possible castles. But again, you can only do one castle in a game. And you cannot undo this, right? You cannot move the king back and move the rook back. This doesn't really happen. That's something illegal, everybody in the game. Okay. So it cannot be undone in the game. And this is what we call castling, everybody. The next thing we're going to see, everybody, is what we call a check. Now, we talked about capturing pieces last week. And then in today's lesson, we're going to talk about attacking the king. You see, you can actually attack the king, everybody. If a piece wants to capture the king, if a piece wants to go to a square in which in the next turn they want to capture the king, that is what we call a check. The king is the most important piece on the chessboard. So everybody, you see, if the rook goes to c1, the rook is actually attacking the king right now. Because if it was white's turn again, the rook would try to go towards the king. And right now, everybody, this is what we call a check. When you make a check, you can say check to your opponent. Now, check is not absolutely mandatory. So if you don't want to say check, you don't have to. Okay? If you want to say check, you can say check. That is also fine. And here's the important thing, everybody. When there is a check, the king has to get out of the check. Right now, the black king is in check, so everybody, black has to defend the king. They have to get the king out of the check. In black's turn, the king is going to move right now to get out of the check. So if they want, everybody, they can move it to this b5 square. Because after the king goes to b5, the black king is no longer in check. So when the king is in check, after black's move, black's king should no longer be in check. For example, everybody, if the king tries to go to here to c5, this is what we call an illegal move, because the king is still being attacked by the rook. Now, we don't win the game if they do a move like this. This is an illegal move. And if somebody does 3 illegal moves in a game, that side loses the game automatically. They get disqualified from the game, because we need to know how the rules work. So everybody, there are actually 3 ways to get out of a check. I'm going to show you the first one. You can move the king basically out of the check, right? After the king moves, the king should not be attacked by any other pieces. The king shouldn't be in a check. You can also block the check, everybody. For example, the bishop can go in between the king and the rook. It's like a little shield, right? The king is no longer seeing the rook because of the bishop. And this is what we call the blocking technique. So the king can escape, you can move the king, or you can block it. And the other option to get out of the check is to actually capture the piece doing the check. Now in this position, that's not really possible. So let me add a few more pieces onto the board. Okay, let me add a few more pieces like this. Okay, now everybody, if this rook, let's make it white's turn. If this rook goes to c1 to do this check, as we said, the king can try to escape to get out of the check. They can block this check with this bishop, which is fine. They can also capture this rook right now. And this is the third way. We're going to talk more about these ways of escaping a check in next week's class, so this is just an introduction. They can also capture the piece doing the check. These are the three methods, everybody. And you see, everybody, if we do a check like this and they decide to move the king right now cannot go to this square. Because if the king tries to go to here, the other white rook will be doing a check to the king. But again, you cannot get into a check when you make your move. That is going to be an illegal move. So when the king is in check, they have to get the king out of the check somehow. All right, so let's see some examples of checks, everybody. And I'm going to ask you all some questions. You can pause the video to think about it, and then you can tell me what you think. Now, everybody, let's say white moves the rook to c7. Is this rook right now attacking the black king? In other words, if it was white's turn again, could the white rook go to the square that the black king is sitting at? Would that be a move that the rook could do? All right, if you said yes, then you are correct. Everybody, the rook is attacking the king in this position. The rook is doing a check. And black should get out of the check right now. Now let me ask you all a question. If the black king goes to the square to f6, is there any white pieces attacking the king right now? All right. If you said yes, you are correct. Good job. Because everybody see the bishop is going to be doing an attack to the king. Therefore, the black king cannot go to this square. Okay, excellent. So if white moves the rook to c7, this is a very, very nice check. All right, so let's see this move. Bishop goes to here. Now, everybody, is this bishop doing a check right now? Is this bishop attacking the black king? All right, so if you said no, you are correct. Good job. Everybody, as we know, the bishop goes like an X, and the bishop cannot attack the king right now. So this is not a check. This is very important. This is not a check right now. So if a piece goes to a square in which it attacks the king, that is what we call a check. And check is very annoying, everybody. When the king is in check, the opponent, or you, whoever's king is in check, they have to defend the king. The king has to get out of the check. It's just like, everybody, when you're taking a shower and you have like shampoo in your hair, if that shampoo gets into your eyes, it's going to burn and it's going to be very painful, right? So what do you try to do? You try to clean your eyes, you try to get that shampoo out of your eyes. So it is just like that. If the king is in check, it is very painful for the king, and the king has to get out of the check in those positions, right? Now you can try to move the king, as we said, you can try to block it, or you can try to capture the piece doing the check, and we're going to see more of this in the next week's class. All right, so this is exactly what we mean by a check. And everybody, in the homework for this week, I'm going to be asking you about checks. All right. We will also go over the special rules again when we are practicing, when we are going over situations. So it is very important that we actually know those special moves because those are actually in accordance to the chess rules, right? There's a reason why they're called special rules. Okay, so everybody, take care. I'll see you in our next class. Bye.